You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to our podcast. This is Why We Do What We Do. I am going to be your open-ended host, Abraham.
And I'm going to be your gentle guiding host, Shane.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. We are a psychology podcast, and we're talking something that I think is pretty comfortably within the sort of psychology domain today. We sort of go off topic sometimes, but this is pretty close.
This is in the realm. I would say if you were at a baseball game, this would be within that ballpark and not outside the parking lot.
Great. Some mixed metaphors for you. And just to begin with. Anyway, if you like what you hear today, you'd like to support us, you can go over to patreon.com/WWD podcast. You can join us for as little as $1 a month, but every tier or level above that you join, there are greater and greater perks and awesome fun things. And, it helps us do what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. So please consider supporting us. We have a pretty large team that donates a lot of their time and effort to this endeavor that we've been on. We'll thank them later as we go, but please consider. We're also going to have merch too. So maybe by the time you hear this, we'll have some cool merch that will be available.
Merch is coming just around the corner. By the time this is out, hopefully our store will be up and live. Just overcoming some growing pains, hurdles with that sort of stuff.
Yeah. More metaphors.
Indeed. You can also support the podcast by just leaving us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. Those positive votes and reviews help outweigh the negative ones where those happen. And anyway, let's go ahead and get into our topic. We're talking about motivational interviewing today.
Yeah. So, Abraham, I have a question for you.
Shoot.
Have you ever had a habit that was difficult to overcome?
Yes. Without revealing too much more, just... Definitely. As a human, yes.
Yeah. Agreed. Were you ever successful in kicking a bad habit?
Yes, sometimes temporarily, but some of them permanently.
Okay, and what were the circumstances that brought about that change? Did someone lecture you about how damaging or unhealthy your behavior was, or how much it irritated them, or was it something that you decided to do for yourself?
100% for myself. No, I definitely react, I think. I'm one of those people that commonly, historically, have been reactive to being told why I should or shouldn't do something.
You know what's funny is I have not known you for that long, really, truly, but I know that about you. I know that about you very well. So what we're talking about today is motivational interviewing, or MI. There's some kind of Mission Impossible joke in there somewhere. Maybe in the background you hear dun, 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 dun.
Indeed.
Or Tom Cruise trying to convince you to be a Scientologist.
Or just run nonstop.
Or just run. So many runs. So like he has run so far. But motivational interviewing is a counseling style designed to bring about changes in behavior by guiding the client to find some kind of motivation within themselves. So they're trying to kind of illuminate on some information. They're trying to find something that's going to kind of help that person change without having to kind of force that information down somebody's throat, really.
Yeah, and so in our conversation today, we're going to talk about what motivational interviewing is, how it came about, what it's used for, if it works, and finally some pragmatic explanations as to sort of the mechanisms or the reasons that this would work and why it may be effective.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go ahead and get into it. What is motivational interviewing?
All right. So motivational interviewing is, as you described, it is sort of a way of talking with and engaging with people, a counseling style. It is grounded in secular humanist philosophy and the Carl Rogers theory of critical counselor skills, which includes accurate empathy, non-possessive warmth, and genuineness. So whatever those might mean, not clearly defined here. Maybe someone out there has better definitions or has any definition, since we're not providing any.
Yeah.
But that's what he describes.
If you're not familiar with Carl Rogers, he was the forerunner of the person-centered approach, which is a paradigm that stated psychotherapists should empower their clients to make choices on their own that were best for themselves. And I really love this approach or this philosophy of working in spaces with in human services. I think that this is something that has translated into a lot of different spaces where when you're designing treatment goals, when you're working in palliative care, when you're working in hospice, there is a little bit of this feel for kind of letting the person drive the ultimate outcomes of their services that they're receiving.
I completely agree. And I think it's something to which we owe, I think where we've evolved is kind of cool historically to look back, because that's not necessarily where things were going to always go. You could certainly have seen how different paths might have emerged in the past, but I think we're all on board with where we're at currently. On an interesting side note, so Carl Rogers and B.F. Skinner apparently debated a few times about the question of why do we do what we do? A name that maybe sounds familiar. Or talking about sort of where our behavior comes from. Rogers coming from a humanist approach and Skinner representing a behaviorist conceptualization. Both sort of schools of thought are still very popular today, but have in many ways begun to overlap over the last several decades in approach, philosophies, ethics, technology, etc. The founders of motivational interviewing have even stated that they've made use of Skinner's learning theory and behavior therapy to incorporate into their conceptualization and implementation of practices with motivational interviewing. Other proponents, Hal Arkowitz, for example, have asserted so much to say that motivational interviewing is in fact a blend of client-centered counseling and behavior therapy. And I think that I can totally see that.
Yeah. Based on what we've kind of read and what we've reviewed about it and stuff, it seems like there's a nice mixture of the two. Now, we're not going to say it's exclusively one or the other, but it is kind of an interesting thing to see how behavior change emerges out of this person-centered approach, if you will.
It does seem like they don't contradict one another. I think the reason that there was debate was in the philosophy of how we understand, I think, determinate causes of human behavior. But the way that we apply that to a clinical setting where we're helping people, they have a lot of agreement.
Yeah.
It's just understanding like how those behaviors come about is where they disagree, but everything else we all are on board with. And so I think that's why the overlap was fairly easy to take place and sort of a natural fit.
I feel like at the time that Rogers and Skinner and all of those folks that were kind of developing psychology, when you started to see these emerging theories, it was still fairly new. And so like when you get into the history of psychology, the idea of psychology was fairly new. So determinants of behavior were fairly new. So there was a lot of debates about that stuff across the board. I mean, I feel like B.F. Skinner was just debating with everybody though. Like
That's
I feel
true.
like he just got caught up in like all kinds of debates with all kinds of people and everybody was like, the Skinner guy.
Yeah.
And Carl Rogers just happened to get looped in there. But again, like we said, like it was a fairly easy overlap compared to some of the other theories that were out there.
It does look like Kyle found a cool sort of flyer for one such debate that we'll include in the notes for this episode and maybe even use like an image for this if we write a little post about it on the website. So anyway, let's talk about William R. Miller. So this is a clinical psychologist who followed Rogers' footsteps and expanded upon the critical counselor skills of accurate empathy, non-possessive warmth, and genuineness that we mentioned before.
Yeah, so he hypothesized that the way clients were spoken to could minimize or enhance their motivation for behavior change and started developing the MI approach in the 1980s, back when, cocaine and hairspray were all the rage. So while he was providing clinical counseling services for addiction treatment, this kind of theory started coming up. Particularly, he was working with alcohol addiction when he started thinking about this approach to addressing these types of behaviors.
In an effort to substantiate and popularize motivational interviewing, this was spearheaded by Miller and Stephen Rollnick in the early 1990s, right alongside Total Request Live and and some of those things.
Neon, hypercolor.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, deep cut for those of you out there, the Voodoo Glow Skulls.
Ooh, that's a good one. I like that.
We'll leave that at that. So for those people who know what that is. And so they were engaged in this campaign as certain techniques and approaches began to see more success over the long term.
Yeah, so in their book, Motivational Interviewing, Preparing People to Change Addictive Behavior, Miller and Rollnick note studies that show sometimes a majority of client dropout rates in clinical practices are spread across the caseloads of only a few clinicians, perhaps suggesting that the way the clients are interacted with may actually be more important than the paradigm from which their therapies are approached, at least at the start. So they're kind of getting into this idea of really looking at, and you'll see there's a lot of studies on this idea of therapist-client interactions, therapeutic alliance, like the rapport building, and we'll talk about some of that stuff as we go. But the idea is that their kind of initial thought was there's something going on with the interaction with that clinician.
One important consideration here is that even if your counselor comes from the same school of thought, background, or approach as their colleagues and the people with whom you maybe have put stock in this idea, it doesn't mean they'll necessarily be successful in motivating change. Like some people, that's just not necessarily a strength of theirs.
Well, right. And I feel like this is true for literally any field of practice. Like, it doesn't matter what theory you subscribe to. Like, you are still a human being that's like an instrument for that tool.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, we see that in behavior analysis literally all the time.
That's a good point. Yeah, I guess it almost goes without saying that there's going to be people who like aren't good at this inside of their field, even though that's what they do.
Yeah. So MI's main argument is that motivation to change should be found within the client themselves and not imposed upon them by the clinician, which on the surface feels really good.
You're right.
Right? I shouldn't be imposing change on you. You should be finding the change in yourself and being able to do it on your own and make that choice.
Exactly. And so central to motivational interviewing is the idea that it's the therapist's task to assist their client to explore and resolve ambivalence or having these mixed contradictory feelings about changing their behavior. And this is different from some of the more traditional approaches where the goal is to sort of, for the therapist to kind of go in and they implement and they intervene where the client is determined, whether or not the client has determined to change. And I think there's a criticism here. I think that someone could see about motivational interviewing and see that as being manipulative because you're like trying to essentially get someone to change by like leading them to it. But I think you could definitely argue that no matter what you're doing with somebody, you're manipulating something if you're trying to help them change. And the one where you're trying to maybe force it feels more manipulative in the way that people don't like than trying to like help them see the way forward in a way that's like they were empowered to do it independently.
I think that's a fair point when you talk about that, because I think that the term manipulation in itself is already kind of a heavy-weighted term.
Yeah, very much so.
But if somebody is coming to you for counseling and they're coming to you for therapy and treatment, then they're essentially, there are people that will come to counseling and therapy that look for a fix. They want you to fix them or fix the problem.
Yep.
But there are other people that go to therapy that look for a guide, or like you're kind of like a psychological Sherpa and you're like working with them through these processes. And so motivational interviewing is going to be definitely more suited for those folks that are looking for a guide, not necessarily hand-holding, but looking for some kind of a little bit of direction. And this is an opportunity to kind of shape them up and find their own direction.
I gotta say, I hope this isn't appropriate, but I really love how Sherpa has become sort of the go-to metaphor maybe for a guide.
Yeah, it
makes me happy.
I like it.
So we're going to talk more about how motivational interviewing works after we let some people talk to you about things they're trying to sell you. So I'll be back in just a moment. All right, we're back. We were just talking about what motivational interviewing is more or less set up to try and do. And so now let's talk, we'll continue to just talk about sort of how it works. So William Miller and Stephen Rollnick, essentially they noted a greater effect that they noted and reported when behavior change initiation starts with the client's own statements about their goals, how the client will want to change their behavior. And motivational interviewing, as sort of a paradigm, calls these statements change talk. And so that's sort of saying that, again, they notice more of an effect if it's on the client side, not the therapist initiating it.
Right, because this kind of language demonstrates that the person is already thinking about kind of a pathway to take, right? So change talks might be statements like, maybe I could cut back on the weekends, or this is really messing me up, or my kids get really upset when I'm drunk and I hate that. And so these statements are the opposite of what they would call sustained talk, which could be statements like, drinking just helps me relax. I don't think I can change, or I don't think my habit is really a problem. So when you start looking at these, change talk is essentially some kind of statement that's going to illustrate that there is a different type of behavior the person can engage in than they're already engaging in. Whereas a sustained talk is kind of a justification for why they continue to engage in the behavior.
That's what I was going to say. I heard in that as well, is sort of making excuses versus essentially saying why I want to change about this.
Right.
Now, I think that some people might get from this is like, well, what if someone's not forthcoming about this? They're only doing the justifying thing. How are you going to get them out of it? And if you're not going to confront them about these topics head on. Now, a confrontation is actually a goal of motivational interviewing. It's just not a style, right? And so in order for clients to change, the idea in motivational interviewing is that they confront themselves, not they're being confronted, lectured, or controlled by someone else. And threats of legal consequences for addiction, for example, would not be considered as intrinsically driven motivation as the catalyst for change, because that's still an imposed external force. So even if they're saying I need to change so that I don't get in trouble with the law, that's not necessarily saying like I need to change because this is not who I want to be, right?
Right. Well, an example that comes to mind when I think about like the idea of confrontation and like personal confrontation is the idea that like I want to eat better because I want to be healthy, but I like what I eat, right? So like you're holding two ideas where it's like I like eating junk food, but I want to eat better. So that's a change statement within that where you still engage, it's two separate behaviors and they confront one another. And the person is kind of confronting the idea of like holding those two ideas at the same time.
Okay, so change talk is important, and we want them to confront it themselves. So Shane, how does motivational interviewing go about promoting this change talk?
That's a great question, Abraham. I'd like to answer that. A therapist practicing MI will generally adhere to what Miller and Rollnick call MI spirit, which includes collaboration, evocation, and autonomy.
They're like, go, MI, go. That's MI spirit.
That was good. That was like for Spirit Week, we're going to have MI spirit. It's going to be wonderful. So basically what the clinician is doing is they're honoring the client's own expertise and their perspective without assuming a better, healthier, or more privileged or less pathological perspective. So basically what they're saying is this person is coming up with ideas, they're having conversations, they're kind of bringing this up to the forefront, and we know that there might be a more appropriate way to go about it or a better change or something like that. The therapist is not saying there's a better way to do this than what you're saying. They're saying, oh, you've brought up an idea of change. Let's go ahead and explore that a little bit. Let's look at that.
Right. Now, all professions in the world like acronyms and initialisms and shorthand ways of saying things, and motivational interviewing is no different. Mm-hmm. They've got their acronyms. One of the acronyms they like is called OARS. Like you're paddling a canoe, oars. And they like this to help remain client-centered by thinking of this acronym where O and OARS stands for open-ended questions. I guess I should have spelled it OARS, OARS.
Yeah.
So O is open-ended questions, A is affirmations, R is reflections, and S is summaries. So one more time, OARS, open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, summaries.
Right. And these are actually just really great counseling skills in general, whether you're doing MI or not. So think about it like this. When we talk about the idea of confrontation, okay, and the idea of like confronting ideas, like a really bad counselor, like, you know, if somebody in counseling would bring up like, I really don't like when I drink, the open-ended question shouldn't be, well, why do you think drinking sucks? Like, it shouldn't be like that. It should be like, well, why are you having that thought? Like, what about that thought? What about drinking makes you feel uncomfortable? Or like, it could be still confrontational and still be soft. And I think that's important to remember when we come to these open-ended questions part of it.
So what this can look like is during the interactions, the therapist provides more attention to the change talk than the sustained talk. And this is essentially, we'll talk about this later and sort of defining what's going on there. But this assumes that the therapist's attention is something that's important to the client, where they're like spending their time on the particular topic. And so they're selectively applying their attention only to those change talk behaviors that the client does, and less attention, not necessarily only to that, but less attention to the sustained talk, the justifications. And the focus of the session turns into statements the client has made that fit the change talk definition, where they're essentially moving them toward saying more about what they can do, what they want for themselves. And so you can think about this a lot of like when you know someone who complains all the time and people always react to their complaints and just feed it over and over. And you see this person just spiral out on their complaints. And I know some people for whom it's like every time you talk to them, you've got to be careful because they will bring up this complaint and they will just go with it.
Right.
And so this is sort of like, rather than feed that complaint, let's redirect it back to something positive by not specifically fueling that. Like, let's not lean in on the complaint, but instead like focus on the positive things.
Yeah, absolutely. And within this too, therapists are going to affirm change talk and emphasize autonomy. They're going to emphasize personal control and the idea that the person is in kind of control of their own destiny. Now, what I think is really important about this, and something that we didn't really unpack within this discussion, is the idea that in counseling, that listening skill is so critical. It is so important, being present and attending to the statements that are being made by the person who is in therapy, in that counseling session, because you're not going to be able to affirm statements accurately. You're not going to be able to reflect those statements accurately, and you're not going to be able to summarize what those statements are to the person if you're not paying attention to what they're saying. And listening is obviously more than just paying attention. There's a lot more to it, but it's a particular skill that counselors have and foster and grow and develop to be able to do things like motivational interviewing and to be able to have this situation where they can attend to the change talk in a really meaningful way.
Right. So you might be listening to this thinking, man, I wish they would just role play an example of what motivational interviewing sounds like so I can really get an idea of what they're talking about. And if you've been thinking that then I've got a treat for you. And if you've been thinking, I really hope they don't do that, then you may want to skip ahead just a little bit. But we're going to take this example, paraphrased directly from Miller and Rollnick's 1991 book, Motivational Interviewing. And we're going to specifically highlight aspects of that ORS acronym that we were talking about and the client talk through in this dialogue.
All right. So here we go. We got to warm up our vocals before we do this.
Yeah. Should I do a voice or something? I'll be like, yeah, I was mean, there's really a problem.
I like that we both have that voice too. It's like, I'm just really sad today. Just surprise me, because this is we're jumping into session. All right, here we go. Good morning. I see that you wanted to have a session to talk about your drinking habits.
Yeah, I mean, it may not really be a problem. My wife wanted me to talk to you, and my doctor said she was kind of concerned, but I'm not really sure why I should be here.
All right, so that statement was a sustained talk, right? So I'm not going to provide, as a therapist, much attention to those statements. Instead, I'm going to shift to a more open-ended question. So here I go. So your doctor and wife are a little concerned. That's a reflection. What are you noticing about yourself and your drinking? That's an open-ended question.
Well, my family has always drank alcohol. It's kind of just been ingrained in me since I was younger. We don't really think about it.
All right, and so that specific thing, we don't really think about it in that statement, is sustained talk.
My dad was always the life of the party.
You've always been around drinking and you've never really had bad experiences with it. So in that statement, that was a summary and reflection type of statement where I'm taking what he said and I'm reframing it.
Right.
I heard you say your dad was the life of the party. What do you mean by that? Again, an open-ended question.
Well, yeah, sadly, he passed away a few years ago of a heart attack.
That must have been really difficult to go through. There's some affirmation.
Yeah, it took us by surprise. We didn't really expect it, and he seemed to be in okay health.
Well, so far you've told me that you've been around alcohol, your family always enjoyed alcohol, and that doesn't really seem like there's a big problem. However, your wife and your doctor are concerned, and you have a family history of heart conditions. So again, that's a summary of everything that they've said so far.
I guess so. Maybe I could cut back a little. I mean, I would like to be there for my kids as long as I can.
Bingo! There's some change talk for you. So now here's where the therapist jumps in and essentially gives a lot of attention to that particular talk and starts having the person come up with their own ideas for what that might look like. Because they came up with the idea, maybe I could cut back a little bit. The therapist never said that. Okay? So when you go back to the transcripts, the therapist never said that. It's kind of nice. All right. I think you're onto something there. So basically what I'm doing is I'm what's called differential reinforcement, attending. I'm reinforcing that change talk, and we're going to go forward from there.
What would you do if you were me? This would be a really big change in my lifestyle.
All right. So this is obviously a best case, and I'm no longer a therapy, and scene.
Yeah,
there
and scene.
So that's what and scene. Da, da, da. So this is obviously a best case scenario, right? Where somebody pretty easily finds that change talk and they're already probably willing to make some changes, that they're coming in with that situation. And in real life counseling sessions are typically much more complex than this. So this is not how it always goes. People have very deeply ingrained values, deeply entrenched habits, and these are really tough for some folks. But this highlights the primary objectives of motivational interviewing specifically and how change talk is evoked and reinforced in that space.
And now, in contrast to this, imagine a situation that does not have a client-centered approach. And what this might look like is that the therapist simply says things like, you should stop drinking so much it could kill you. What if you get a DUI? That sort of thing. And in this situation, you can really, for yourself, imagine, and for most other clients, other people in that situation, they're more likely to be defensive, to shut down, provide excuses and rationalizations. And the effect of the statement may be transient at best. Like maybe that sort of gets them thinking about it a little bit, but mostly they're like, I'm going to drink even harder now.
Yeah, some people just don't like being told what to do. And the minute that you give them a directive, they're going to do the polar opposite. And it happens. It happens a lot. So that is an example, that last part of confronting without any sort of care or attending to what might be the person's preference.
Now, we are going to talk about how this all might work and whether or not it works after we take another quick break to listen to some people sell you things. All right, so we were just talking about, we give an example of what the motivational interviewing could look like, and then sort of a brief example of what a more confrontational style would look like. So let's talk about, does this work?
Since the 90s, there has been empirical evidence for motivational interviewing's positive effects on behavior, particularly in the areas of addiction and public health. And these include some of the following areas. There is some evidence to support its use in alcohol abuse, illicit drug use, HIV risk reduction, and smoking cessation, just to name a few.
Treatment adherence, gambling, water purification and safety is an interesting one.
One of these things is not like the other one.
I'm like, that seems like a systemic problem, but maybe people really need to be having in their behavioral routine that they're purifying water.
Yeah.
Also, eating disorders, and then diet and exercise.
Yeah, so Moyers and Martin in 2006 found that clinician speech consistent with MI, or adhering to ORs, promoting autonomy, stuff like that, it actually evoked more change talk. It actually produced more change talk in those sessions. And speech that was inconsistent with MI, like providing advice, for example, actually provoked more sustained talk. Like you saw way more, I'm not going to do that, way more, stop telling me what to do, you're not my dad type of situations.
Right, yeah. So essentially just saying that back using a little bit different words is that people were more likely to initiate their own ideas about how they want to change because it's important to them in the motivational interviewing style. And they were more likely to provide justifications and dig their heels in when they had that sort of confrontational style.
Mm-hmm.
There was also a study by Amrian, maybe 2003, found that clients who engaged in higher rates of change talk experienced improvements in their subsequent treatment outcomes as well.
Yeah, and then Game, Gmel, and Dapin. That's the best attempt I'm going to have with those names.
Sounded good.
I thought I pulled it off. See, I got to say stuff with confidence and just move through it instead of just like being like, I don't know, because it's, Anyway, in 2008, they found that increased change talk led to better outcomes in treatments for decreasing alcohol consumption. So they found that pretty consistent.
And then another one, Bayer in 2008, found that change talk was correlated with increased abstinence from using illicit drugs and that sort of thing. And there is so much research on substance abuse and abstinence from substance abuse and that sort of thing that I can imagine that is one that people who work in that space would want to have in their arsenal if it is that effective.
Yeah, absolutely. So motivational interviewing's explanation for why it's effective is important too, because we want to actually see why it might be effective, but they have their own explanation for it. And so Miller and Rollnick embrace self-perception theory to explain MI's effectiveness.
And to be clear, self-perception is defined as judgments made about oneself by oneself. This is our self-talk where we judge ourselves. We look in the mirror and we say like, whatever thing you have to say about yourself. But even just like as you're doing anything, you hear people who are like, oh man, I'm such an idiot, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So when clients themselves make statements about themselves, they're more likely to identify for themselves the problem and solution to make the appropriate changes with their now quote unquote unlocked motivation.
Yeah. So as we kind of look at that doesn't really give us kind of a mechanism by which this stuff is effective, right? Like a deterministic view of why stuff is effective. So let's go ahead and get into a more behavioral explanation for why we find MI so effective.
Now, and I should say really quick that with the judgment piece, that could go both. Like it could also be judgment where you would have a positive evaluation of yourself. I made it sound like it was only negative, but it could certainly be. Yeah. Anyway, we were talking about behavioral explanation. So Christopher and Doerr in 2009 provide a really cool behavioral account for motivational interviewing and the possible variables that explain how this works in a session.
Yeah, so as clinicians help to kind of evoke or produce this change talk, basically what they're doing is they're providing some type of like cue for this type of behavior to occur using that ORS technique and other mechanisms. The client engages in more change talk. So what's happening is the therapist provides a cue, the behavior occurs, that change talk occurs, and the clinician provides affirmation and empathy, which can be a type of reinforcement for somebody. And basically we know that by definition, reinforcers or rewards for that type of behavior are likely going to increase those frequencies of behavior. So it's likely that change talk will contact some kind of reward in session through affirmations and reflections and summaries. And so the client is more likely to engage in some change talk as a result.
If anybody saw the movie The Master with Joaquin Phoenix and Philip Seymour Hoffman and thinking like, what does it look like related to that? It doesn't. That is not at all. I think you could maybe call it the opposite, but that's okay. We're moving on. So understanding an important piece of this is that our environment or our circumstances, I think you could think of those two things interchangeably here. that promotes a wide range of both change and sustained talk, because there are these really unpleasant outcomes like lecturing or preaching that I think people come to expect that are absent in that context, right? In the motivational interviewing context, that kind of stuff isn't there.
Yeah.
Empathy, affirmation, and acceptance makes the person who's sitting in the chair, the clinician, they now are a signal of the availability of a positive reaction to what you're saying.
Yeah.
A word that probably resonates well with people to describe this is it's validating, right? And so it creates a context where the therapist is validating versus one where the therapist is like cracking a whip telling you what to do. And that can create kind of a weird relationship. Sometimes you get people who are like, yes, this is what I need. I need someone to lead me. And then they feel like they don't necessarily have control over it themselves. They need that crutch. And I think that there is reason to believe that's not the ideal therapeutic relationship to have with a client. Now, some people might disagree with me, and I think that's fine. And I think that it's not a blanket black and white, it is always one way or another. I think the relevant part here is just understanding that there are broader implications for that sort of approach. So in this context, in motivational interviewing, as the client talks about the problem, there are certain elements of what they say that can be more sort of recognized and acknowledged by the clinician, and then doing that increases the probability of those types of statements throughout the conversation, and those types of statements can lead to a broader orientation to positive actions in the desired direction.
And another part of this too is you brought up the idea of validation. And I think that when we feel more accepted, when we have an audience that listens to us and understands our situation, we're more likely to share, we're more likely to talk, we're more likely to kind of talk out what those problems are. So that type of validation and the reward from that listener is going to be way more effective when it's genuine. And then that is an indicator of good therapeutic relationships and rapport and stuff like that. If I have a good relationship with somebody, I'm more likely to share with somebody, and I'm more likely to talk out my problems and stuff like that. Like I said before, we talked about the idea of therapeutic alliance and all that. And ultimately, what's interesting about this is that it is really all verbal behavior, right? It's all language.
That's right.
Everything that we're talking about is language and different types of language that reward and punish and do all kinds of things to this type of these change statements and these sustain statements. Now, when we talk about this type of verbal behavior, we talk about this language, when we say, if someone says, that must have been difficult, but doesn't put any work to listen or understand, it's not going to have that same kind of validation. Oh, it's right. The equivalent of somebody going, oh, that sounds rough.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. And there's nothing else to it. But if they say, that must have been difficult, I'm so sorry to hear about your father, or that must have been difficult, I'm so sorry that you're struggling with that. Why do you think this is such a struggle? Like having those, like that interest really kind of takes hold and really shapes up a whole different set of language.
It's that sort of surface level, what feels like perfunctory reaction to something. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh yeah, that sucks. Sorry for you.
Yeah.
That it doesn't feel authentic, and therefore we don't react to it authentically.
Right.
And I think we sometimes have that experience when we like have to call a customer service thing and someone's like, sorry to hear about your problem. We'll do everything we can to fix it. You're very important to us. And it just feels like, no, I'm not.
Yeah. Right.
And I don't know. There's probably more to say about that, but I think another thing that comes up inside of this and understanding what is happening is we talk about this idea of someone being sort of intrinsically motivated to make their own change. Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a couple ways to think about that. One of the things that's going on here is that we're talking about a situation where the therapist allows this person to sort of guide themselves toward what their action should be, right? By helping them to just reflect on what they would like to be sort of as a person. So one thing I would say is that I wouldn't call that intrinsic, because you have someone right there who's like trying to help you get there.
Right.
And now your motivation is not necessarily that person, but it's not like it just spontaneously happened from inside you. So I think that there's an argument about calling it intrinsic for that reason. But if we're going from the fact that like, okay, the therapist isn't telling them what to do, they're finding it on their own, therefore it is intrinsic. Okay, that's fine. I think the way to think about this then is going back to what you said of this verbal behavior idea. And the fact that we have these values, and values are these verbally constructed statements about what is important to us. And we often sort of do this thing, not necessarily overtly, but we kind of recognize and say out loud or whatnot. We recognize the things that are important to us that are the intangibles of the world. And they can be important because we have assigned them importance, because we can think abstractly about things because we have language, right? And so the idea here is that as someone does things that are in line with what they've identified as their values, then that feels like good to us, right? That feels like we're doing something positive. We feel happy about the thing that we've done. And so that is the thing that carries us forward, is the fact that it's all in line with things that are important to us. And in that way, it's a sort of automatic self-rewarding process of I'm doing the thing that is important to me, that I said that was important to me, that I said that I would do. And that sort of has a snowball effect, or maybe it's a self-perpetuating effect is maybe a better way of putting it, where it can kind of carry its own way forward. And so that's what I think people maybe are talking about when they say this intrinsic motivation is the fact that we are doing things that are sort of inherently in line with what we want.
I think that makes perfect sense. Now, another part of this, we've kind of brought up the idea of verbal behavior, and essentially a lot of what's happening is the person that's in the session is labeling a wide range of potential outcomes. They're labeling their concerns. They're labeling action and non-action. They're labeling all these things, and when they label those things, essentially they're laying out a pathway where they go, it could be this choice, 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 and here's all these things. But when the therapist decides to attend to certain labels or certain actions or certain consequences, what is happening is they're also eliminating those other outcomes or actions that aren't really that possible. Right? So the therapist is actually enacting, they're going, oh, well, that sounds like that might be an appropriate choice. Why do you think that's an appropriate choice? Now you've kind of set up like, oh, here's a green light for this choice, this choice, this choice, and this choice, just simply by labeling and having the therapist attend to it. So, for example, if the patient says something along the lines of, I could be a healthier person if I quit smoking, or if they said, I'm not going to quit, then essentially what's happened is the patient has laid out two options, right? They've labeled two options. I could do this or do this.
Right.
But when the therapist says, oh, maybe you would be healthier if you quit smoking, what do you think about that? What does that pathway look like? And by attending to that, they've eliminated the sustain statement, right? I'm not going to go that pathway. And they've essentially created a new path with this affirmation, with this choice that the person wants to be a healthier person, or they could be. So now they're essentially labeling a path and kind of continuing down that road.
Right. Now, I think some of those critical thinking people out there are going to be saying like, okay, but we can say we're going to change, and that doesn't mean we're actually going to do anything differently. And a lot of people have that experience. I mean, this is New Year's resolutions all over again, right? Saying that we're going to do something does not mean it's going to happen. But in this context, why would that change talk lead to a better outcome? Just because I'm saying I'm going to change my lifestyle, it doesn't mean that our lifestyle is then going to actually change. Christopher and Dewar theorized that the social expectations are developed between the client and the clinician in this therapeutic setting as the client begins to sort of work through this process. And so that might be that there is, again, it's like an external sort of validating piece here of like, I'm not judging you for what you do, but you're going to be reporting to me the things that you're doing. And so there's this sort of expectation on the part of the client who says like, I want to be able to, like, someone is actually watching my progress on this. I don't have an out for, if I make a promise to myself that nobody knows about, if I break that promise, nobody knows.
Right.
Like, my promise just is what it is. But there's someone else here who's now sort of roped into this deal I made with myself. And so I feel a little bit added pressure to stick to my guns on the thing that I said that I would do. And so where we experience those moments of, I want to give up because this is hard, change is hard, then you have instead this expectation of like, no, I'm going to stick to this because I want to be able to keep my word to myself and keep my word to this other person that I've brought in on this journey with me.
I think that's a huge influence. I mean, we want people to affirm, validate us. We want those things, especially from people that we hold in high regard, right? If we have a good therapeutic relation with our therapists, then we're more likely to engage in behavior change because we are looking to contact that social affirmation from them too. Like, if I don't care what my therapist says, then I'm not going to engage in behavior to change anything to get a reward from them. Like, they don't really matter at that point in time. So it makes perfect sense if we have good relationships that we would seek affirmation from those folks.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to take one more quick advertisement obligation where they're going to say things to you. We'll be right back, and then we'll have some recommendations for you. Okay, so for me, some major take-home points about this, and really the big one, because before doing more research about this, I had kind of like a vague idea of what motivational interviewing is, and I felt like I learned a lot. And the big take-home for me, again, I think honestly, is kind of the ORS approach. It's that motivational interviewing creates an opportunity to ask open-ended questions to sort of help a client, I guess, arrive at a conclusion on their own.
I think a big thing for me as we're kind of exploring this is that this is not something that happens independent of a therapist. I mean, somebody might kind of do this on their own. They might come to the conclusions on their own and stuff, but motivational interviewing requires like a facilitator. And that therapist is the person that's kind of a conduit for those questions, for the affirmation, it's like they're a source of reward for that person to help shape up those behaviors, even if they're not directly giving them advice or telling them what to do. They are still helping kind of guide them through that process and kind of work out their own stuff.
Another take home I think is relevant is that I think that this is a relevant way of just sort of talking to people. What I wouldn't say is like, don't try and go out and get people to change their behaviors. But I think what you could take away from the motivational interviewing that I really like is it just sort of makes you a better listener. Like, you don't necessarily have to be a motivational interviewer. And like, again, I really am not encouraging you. Please don't go out and like try and manipulate people's behavior using this.
Right.
I think if you were just listening with the approach of like, I'm interested in what you have to say and I want to hear what your thoughts are and try and like be validating, I think that is just going to make you an audience that people will want to have around. So if you want people to like feel comfortable talking to you and like you enjoy having relationships with people who like talking to you, having this as sort of your listener skill will help you in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a big take home for me too, is like this is just a really nice, good way to be a human. And just by being a good listener, you can impart so much change and help somebody really get through some stuff that they're struggling with. So for your friends that like ask you for advice, have them kind of sort it out. Don't give them advice. Let's see what happens when you just listen.
Yeah. Listening is good. Now there are obviously like if you are technically an expert at something and they are like, hey, like I literally have no idea what I'm doing here. The motivational interviewing I think is more about when people could have the answer on their own. Right. If I like went to my mechanic and I was like, my car isn't working, and they're like, well, what do you think is wrong with it? And I'm like, I don't know, man. This is not my job. It's well outside my scope of competence.
Yeah, of course.
So anyway, I think I'm good on that. You have anything else on motivational interviewing before we get to some recommendations?
Nope, I think I'm good.
Then we are ready to recommend some things.
Yeah! Recommendations.
All right, I am recommending a SodaStream.
Ooh.
I've had one for a little over a year, and I really like it. Now, I think I don't use it as much as I would like to be using it because I only have one, like they have these like specific bottles that are designed to go into it. And I only have one. And so I have to like wash it in between. I like to make like sparkling waters with it. Sort of like the LaCroix, people like that.
Yeah.
And you can get these like flavors that are these really subtle, non-sugary flavors to do that. And so I really like my SodaStream and I'd recommend it for people who can afford such luxuries as a SodaStream.
I love that. I am going to recommend food. So I have recently been messing around in the kitchen a lot lately. And the one thing that I have, my daughter has asked me to make time and time again is birria tacos.
Okay.
Which are like the tacos that like the tortilla is like soaked in like a tomatoey broth type of sauce. And then they're like grilled and they're like formed like quesadillas. And then you have a dipping sauce to go along with it. And so I made a vegan version of this.
Nice.
It was absolutely wonderful. I made it with portobello mushrooms. I diced them up, and they used that as like the crumble instead of using ground beef.
Okay.
And you make the sauce. You cook the insides. It's like the sauce is everywhere. So you basically like you cook the filling with the sauce. You dip the tortillas into the sauce and then grill the tortillas, and then you dip all of that into the sauce too. So it's a very like strong flavor, but it is absolutely wonderful, and I am so excited to do it again.
This sounds pretty amazing. I might steal that recipe from you.
Yeah. Oh, it's so good. Apparently, I did a European version of it, which requires more tomato sauce than it does like some of the chilies and stuff that you use. So I'm going to try to do a different version of it that's a little bit more authentic. So It wasn't quite as authentic as I would like, but it was still really good.
Cool.
Yeah.
we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. If you are motivational interviewing, or you have used motivational interviewing, or it's been used on you, we'd definitely love to hear your story. You should reach out to us. You can contact us on all of the social media platforms. You can email us directly with questions, comments, or if you just want to say, hi, you guys are great, you can do that by emailing us at info@wwdpodcast.com. At the time that this episode launches, we should have our merch store up and running that is going to have some coffee mugs and at least one t-shirt design. And because we are launching a brand new store, we're going to go ahead and promote with a little discount for like a, hey, welcome to our store. We're want to start with a little sale on things so that people want to come check us out. So you should do that.
Yeah.
Help support the show and get some cool swag along the way.
Yeah.
So this episode is coming out right at the beginning of February. February is Black History Month. So we're also going to be posting some stuff on social media about Black History Month and going to remind people about Black History Month throughout the month. And hopefully we'll just start including some tidbits about some things on that as we go through.
I love that.
Awesome. Before we go, I also need to thank the people who make this show possible. There are Patreon supporters that includes Amanda, Kathleen, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, and Shauna. And if you would like your name on that list, you should head over to Why We Do What We Do on Patreon and join us there. Also, thank you so much to our amazing team, Justin, Britt, Shane, Selena, Kyle, who is responsible for helping put together the notes for these episodes and did a great job.
Yes.
And Alan, and of course, I think that's all that I have. Anything else from you?
Nope, that's it.
This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.